It's now my turn to introduce our croupier, Mr. Jack Cruickshanks. Again, I mean, what can I say that hasn't already been said about our croupier? As you probably know, I mean, Jack hails from Dorai, and it's probably fair to say that, with the exception of a few days back in August in 1946, when his mum was staying at the Buckridden Maternity Hospital in Kilwinning, Jack has spent his entire life living in the town. Whether that was in a single end in the West End with outside amenities, which must have been awful cold in the winter, or in brand new house at the Blair scheme in the 50s, or in the Lynn during the 60s and 70s, or even in St Andrew's Garden where he stays today with his wife Jean, who he met in 1971. You can certainly say that Dorai is in his DNA, which in this instance, DNA stands for Dorai, North Ayrshire. As last year, Jack attended Dorai Primary School and the high school, and at the ripe old age of 16, he left the high school to head out into the big, scary world and began his apprenticeship as an electrician in Kilburnie at W&J Knox Thread Mill and Networks. This is where his education in life really began. Now, from some of the stories that I've heard, being a young apprentice in the 1960s at Knox's Mill, it certainly seemed a scary place indeed for such an innocent, or so he says, young man. From what I can understand, the workplace at Knox's was a bit like the high Arctic, where packs of young ladies would roam the factory floor, hunting down young, innocent boys to carry out unspeakable initiation ceremonies upon them, which was either very lucky, as these ceremonies can't be expressed in words, or Jack just didn't want to go into too many of the details. So I'll bow to his better discretion on this point. It was also considered a rite of passage for a young apprentice to be asked to join the tradesmen in the pub after work, where they would continue their education, and this seemed to be an area where Jack would help prop up the bar with the best of them. But as the 60s came to an end, and with time served as a qualified electrician, it was time to seek out pastures new. In 1969, Jack started working at Roche Products as a spark, but he quickly changed his career path and retrained as an instrument technician. And in 1982, he became a supervisor in the new vitamin C plant, which led to business trips to Switzerland and Germany, and would ultimately spark his lust for travel in later life. In 2005, and after over 30 years of working at Roche Products, Jack decided it was time for a career change. When the opportunity arose to take voluntary redundancy, he took it. However, Jack was still far too young to retire, and he quickly embarked on a new career as a project engineer with Booth Welsh Automation, who are an engineering technology company based out of Henderson Nuclear Power Station in West Kilbride, where he would help to rewrite many of the original, but hopefully not too out-of-date procedures for the nuclear power station, which, interestingly or scarily enough, were originally written when Jack was still working at Knox's Mill back in the 1960s. However, the business travel involved in his new job wasn't quite the same as it had been with Roche. And after visiting lots of nuclear power plants around the UK, mostly in the bleak midwinter, I might add, Jack finally decided to call it a day, and he retired with a healthy glow in his cheeks in 2011. He now spends his time pre-COVID cruising the oceans with his wife Jean, who he married in 1976. And who knows, pretty soon, and with vaccinations permitting, travel will be back on the agenda. When he's not travelling, he spends his time catching up with his 2 daughters and grandchildren, or talking a good game of golf with his cronies at the 19th hole. Gentlemen, I give you our croupier, Mr. Jack Cruickshanks.
Thank you, David. Mr. Chairman, fellow members of the Rye Burns Club, honoured guests. It's often said that behind every great man is an as great or greater woman. At least so my wife's been telling me for the last 45 years. We did look no further back than the middle of the last century to see this in action. Two of the giants of the 20th century were not only themselves formidable, but so were their wives. In 1921, an aspiring US politician was diagnosed with polio, which left him paralyzed from the waist down. He felt that his burgeoning political career, he had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I, was over. But his wife, whom he had married in 1905, would have none of it. And by 1928, he was the governor of New York, and 4 years later would be elected President of the United States. That man was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his wife was called Eleanor. Although reluctant to step into the role of the First Lady, she began to transform the traditional role of that of more of a social hostess, to become more visible and an active participant in her husband's administration. This was during the time of the Great Depression and also leading up to the Second World War. As First Lady, she would travel across America, acting as her husband's eyes and ears, reporting back, visiting various government institutions, programs, and other facilities. She was an early activist for civil rights and was an advocate for women. And she encouraged her husband to appoint more women to federal positions. Roosevelt proved he was a man of her time, but without the strength of his wife in persuading him to continue in politics, history may have been completely different. Clementine Hozier married Winston Churchill in 1908. Much like Eleanor, she would be the one to persuade her husband to continue through all the adversaries he would encounter through his long political career. She was she was his rock, and he could cling even more so when he was elected Prime Minister. She became his trusted confidant. She exerted an influence over her husband and the government that may appear unusual in modern times. She was involved in some of the most crucial decisions of the war and appeased Stalin and de Gaulle when they wanted more direct action. When we got now to the romance of the marriage of Robert Burns and Jean Armour, it's been well documented, but what do we really know about their early courtship? Much is already well known, such as the year they met, when they were married, when the children's births and deaths were, etc. However, they don't say much about their lives together, their thoughts about each other. Do we really know much about their early courtship, their separation, and finally their lives as a married couple? We know how the relationship ended, but do we really know how it began? When did Jean fall in love with Burns and vice versa? The word love is often thrown around with little thought to what it actually means. Perhaps Shakespeare got it right when he wrote, "The course of true love never did run smooth." Indeed, never was a truer word spoken as regard the love story of Robert Burns and Jean Armour. From the day she laid eyes on him in 1784 until his death in 1796, she gave herself to him in body and in soul. It has to remember that Burns had not long moved to Farmouth-Gill, but his reputation as a womanizer had preceded him. Indeed, the news that Elizabeth Peyton had a child by him was common knowledge, and he had endured 3 penitential sessions in the kirk for his fornication. It's no wonder then that any self-respecting father would not wish his daughter to have anything to do with such a man. So how did the respectable Jean Armour fall under his spell? In public, they would only admire each other from afar. As far as their parents would never allow their daughter to become associated with such a man, you might think that admiration from afar would not be the ideal introduction to romance. So how did the couple love begin? One version of their first meeting is that Burns danced during race week in April 1784. For whatever reason, he was heard to remark that he wished he could find a lass who would love him as faithfully as his dog. A few days later, whilst crossing the drying green in Mauchline, a girl, presumably Jean, asked him if he had found his lass yet. If true, it would appear that she sought him out. So from that point, how did a courtship begin? Being seen out together was out of the question. What they needed was what was called a backfit, or a go-between, someone to keep a secret. There's a suggestion that this function was carried out by an elderly Auckland woman called Catherine Govan. It would appear that Burns set this up so that their secret would be kept. In that event, Catherine must have been compliant and wished the young couple well. The plan was for Jean to spend several weeks or several days a week with Catherine on the pretext of teaching her embroidery and needlework. It would appear she spent only a short time there before sneaking off to meet Burns somewhere more private. When the time came to return home, she would collect her embroidery, which Catherine had embellished, before heading home to her unsuspecting parents. In addition, Robert and Jean both asked friends to act as a chaperone. Therefore, any time they were seen in public would not bring them noteworthy gossip. Jean had never met anyone like Burns, and she could not resist him. This spirited, lively, attractive young woman, not passive as is often depicted, was in love, and anything would say would change that. However, because Jean was dependent on her father, the relationship with Burns would in the end cost her dearly. The fact that she was willing to defy social and religious convention says much at a time when women were seen and not heard. They must have spent some time in other pursuits, as Jean admired Burns' love of breeding and he admired her beautiful singing voice as the sweetest wood notes wild. In his eyes, she was the epitome of a proper young lady and was the jewel of all others. Miss Miller is fine, Miss Markland's divine, Miss Smith she has wit, and Miss Betty is braw. There's beauty and fortune to get with Miss Morton, but Armour's the jewel for me o' them all. Unfortunately, the secret relationship came to an end when Jean became pregnant. Burns was seemingly delighted and wrote a document which in those days constituted a marriage contract and which both of them signed. In March 1786, on being told the news, Jean's parents tried to conceal the pregnancy by sending her to relatives in Paisley. Burns' first impulse seems to have been to marry her. She suggested as much in a letter to Gavin Hamilton in April, and in the same month told Anna of Dalhousie, I would gladly have covered my inner Martha from the darts of calumny with the conjugal shield, nay, had actually made up some sort of wedlock, but I was at that time deep in guile, and being unfortunate, for which good and lawful objection, the lady's friends broke all measures, and drove me au despoir. He was a great man for writing a chapter where a sentence would suffice. As the document had not been officiated by the Kirk, James Armour destroyed the document by cutting out the couple's names. James then informed Burns that Jean had shunned him by allowing her father to destroy the document. However, Holy Willie Fisher was soon in the scent. The minutes of Mifflin Kirk's session for 10th of June 1786 show that Jean was called, compared not, but sent a letter to the minister in which she wrote, I am heartily sorry, but I have given and must give your session trouble on my account. I am with child and Robert Burns of Misdeal as the father. I am with great respect your humble servant. Burns regarded Jean's giving up the letter to her father and her departure to Paisley as desertion. We can only imagine how he felt at this time. Normally, he was the one who walked away from relationships. Did he feel slighted, wronged that she had proved fickle and undeserving? Jean was allowed to return home after a few months, but by then Burns' attention had moved on to another. On the 3rd of September 1786, Jean gave birth to the twins Robert and Jean. On the 3rd of September, with the publication of the Kilmarnock edition in July 1786, Burns had found some fame and could not resist the temptation of impressing Jean at the close of one of his tours in the summer of 1787, and the inevitable happened as she became pregnant again. However, her parents, who now that Burns had found some fame, thought he might be a good catch after all, and that marriage was not a bad idea. They were furious and virtually threw her out. Burns, who was in Edinburgh, asked Willie Muir of Bolton to give her shelter, and he returned in February 1788 and got a room for her in Mauchline. Shortly afterwards, a second set of twins were born, but unfortunately died a few weeks later. Shortly afterwards, in March, Jean was made to swear that she would never try to claim him as a husband. But between April and May, things had changed. In a letter to his uncle Samuel Brown in 1788, he hinted that he had married Jean, although the marriage wasn't registered until August in Mauchline. As many other cases, the cart came before the horse, in that Jean had already given birth to 4 of the children, the couple's 9 children, the final one on the day of her husband's funeral. Only 3 of whom survive her. For whatever reasons, they were married before a JP in the office of Gavin Hamilton. The parish records describe them as having been irregularly married some years ago. However, the deed was now done, and they moved as a family to Ellisland. In 1791, they renounced the lease in Ellisland and moved to Dumfries. It is there they spent the remaining years of Burns' life. There are no words to describe the regard this woman should be held in, bearing 9 children in 10 short years, while her husband roamed the country, mixing with the great and the good of Scottish society, at the same time having numerous affairs and siring numerous other children, and at the same time, it must be said, writing some of the greatest poetry and songs of his or any other generation. So what do we make of Jean Armour? Naive, infatuated, compliant? Perhaps, but she was also a woman who loved her man despite his wild extravagances, his continued pursuit of other women, even to the extent of taking in his bastard daughter by Anna Park. Our Robbie should have had 12 wives. There's no doubt Jean loved Robert with all her heart and soul, but more to the point, did Robert love Jean? I remember when Prince Charles was asked on his engagement to Diana, "Are you in love?" He replied, "Whatever love means." In the early days of their courtship, I believe this may have been an answer Burns would have given, but in later life, his attitude seemed to have changed. It was in a letter to Peggy Chalmers in 1788, he told her that his marriage was not the consequence of the attachment of romance, perhaps, but I had a long and much loved fellow creature's happiness or misery in my determination, and I durst not trifle with so important a deposit, nor have I any cause to repent it. I have got the handsomest figure, the sweetest temper, the soundest constitution, and the kindest heart in the country. In all, Burns would write 14 songs commonly associated with Jean, among them I Hae a Wife o' My Ain, and perhaps the best of them all, O O'er the Airs the Wind Can Blaw. But perhaps her greatest asset was that she was there, not as an intellectual equal of Burns, but as a buttress to everything else that was going on around him. It was she he came home to. It was she who inspired some of his most beautiful songs. It was she who kept the family together. Jean outlived her husband by 38 years and lived to see his name become celebrated throughout the world. Latterly, she suffered from high blood pressure and suffered a series of strokes, the second of which left her partly paralysed and dependent on her favourite granddaughter, Sarah. Although the poems and songs written by Burns had become hugely popular, he appears to have left little or no money, and so Jean was left in straitened circumstances. When this became known, many people came forward and ensured that the family could live a decent life without the threat of destitution hanging over them. She died on 26th of March 1834 in Dumfries, aged 69, and was buried alongside her husband in the mausoleum especially built to commemorate him in St. Michael's churchyard. A fitting resting place for the woman behind the man. Gentlemen, I would ask you to charge your glasses. To toast Jean Armour.
Jean Armour.